you. Good to be here. It's lovely to be here with, I see so many friends from the Power of the Word conferences, which I have been involved in with Francesca Knox from the beginning. And I always say, I've always actually been very hesitant to go to any academic conference. The only one I will always go to is the Power of the Word. Because I feel like this is a confluence of religion and poetry, which is just to me, it's one of the most strongest connections one can possibly have. Because I always say that Scripture is Scripture is poetry, and poetry is living Scripture, that the inspiration keeps coming in poets. And that's the great thing about it, prophetic word, which is going to be our next conference, which I hope you'll all come to in Oxford, 2017. Michael, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. You mentioned, just happened to see the back of some newspaper as I was coming in here. It said, Christopher Hitchens, toward the end of his life, turned toward religion. Something like that. I only saw the headline. But I debated him about a year before he died. I was invited to debate Hitchens at the Pennsylvania Book Festival. And I don't know why I agreed, on the existence of God. And so they called me and they said, you know, you'll be for God, he'll be against God. And I thought it was just somehow an irresistible invitation. And I got there, and there were, you can look it up on Google, there were 2,000 people in the audience, and they turned away 3,000 wanting to get into it. And they had some moderator who was a Pennsylvania Supreme Court judge who was going to be somehow the referee between us. And I realized as I got on the stage what a terrible mistake I'd made. You know, I never debated. I mean, in fact, as I drove into this Pennsylvania town, there was a billboard. I swear to God, it said, "The Great Debate, Is There a God? Hitchens versus Parini." I thought, I'm so ruined. You know, I've never, apart from my wife, I've never debated anyone. And and I thought, you know, I said to Hitchens, we're standing backstage. I'd never met him before. I said, have you ever done this debate? He said, actually, just last week I debated the same subject. I debated Tony Blair in Toronto. I said, what am I into here? And so what do you do in these situations? You know, of course, I happen to believe in God. I'm a Christian, and I've never made any bones about it. I say it over and over again, and I've said it in print 1,000,000 times. So, yet it's another thing to actually stand on the stage and go back and forth with somebody as clever as Hitchens. You know, he's very good. So, you know, I'm sure I was killed in the debate. I didn't care. I mean, the things, you know, if you don't care, you're very free. You know what I'm saying? You know, and so I was able actually to use that as my opening ploy. I said, Mr. Hitchens has debated this subject 1,000,000 times. And I said, this is the first time and probably the last time I'll ever debate anyone. I said, what a mistake to choose this guy to debate. But though just the one little point that I think that, where I did score one good point or whatever, a point, I said that I thought that atheists like you, Mr. Hitchens, atheists like this man, and extreme fundamentalists, whom we all know who they are essentially two sides of the same coin. And Hitchens said, oh, what do you mean? What? I said, no, you're just a fundamentalist, Christopher. I said, you believe in, I said, you guys have this narrow band of reality where everything is either black or white. And I said, to have an absolute view of either way thinking about God is simply fundamentalism, literalism. And I said, you know, what my interest in Christianity is that we're interested in Christ as a mythic pattern and mythos in the sense of a story that is true, a story which has contours which can actually inform us and shape our lives. And for me, that's where the heart of Christianity lies, in the life of Jesus and how he teaches us not only to live, but how to die. I mean, there's the ars moriendi, the art of dying. Is, you know, we're all heading there. Some of us are closer than others, but we don't know. But nevertheless, it's all a short spell anyway. So Christ teaches us how to live, how to die, but also mainly, I think what interests me is in how to live, how to behave. Where in the life of Christ can we find inklings, oddments, omens, moments that are going to help us to get through the day, to behave with other people in community, to create a society that might be just, if we can think of what that might mean, and have times of inspiration and hope. To me, that's the essence of Christianity in practice. And so it brings me to the topic of my talk tonight, T.s. Eliot's Four Quartets as a pattern for Christian living. When I told, again, my wife that this was the title of my talk, she burst into laughter. She said, that sounds like something that, a talk someone might have given in 1920 or probably 1897. I mean, I've spent plenty of time at MLA conferences, modern and academic. I've been, believe me, my share of them in my life. I've even written my share of these tedious papers, and too many of them for one lifetime. And I know the kind of how most of my colleagues in the field would think, this is an absurdity to give a talk on T.s. Eliot's Four Quartets as a pattern for Christian living. That's not what you're meant to talk about in literary criticism. Literary criticism is about, certainly once the new criticism came along, you stopped even thinking remotely about the purpose of literature. You just basically, I.A. Richard just wanted us to, look at the poem on the page, not even know when it was written or who it was written for, or think about what purpose it might serve in life. It's just something that you analyze for its ironies and paradoxes and so forth and so on. Certainly, once you get into post-structuralism, this kind of a paper would be absolutely inexplicable on every level, wouldn't it, Angela? Inexplicable on every imaginable level that you could give it. Think that I'm going to read T.s. Eliot's Four Quartets as a pattern for Christian living. But nevertheless, I think with Dr. Johnson that the purpose of literature is to help us to live our lives, or possibly to live our lives in a better way. And I have always used Four Quartets over 50 years of reading it as bedtime reading and as something to say, I believe it can teach me something about how to live my life, especially my spiritual life. I think it's important for that. So that's how I'm going to go for this today. So I'm going to have to take these glasses on there. Aren't they amazing? Magic trick. I found them. It's amazing what you can find online. Clicking glasses. There we go. People keep saying to me, "Oh, you've broken your glasses." I said, no. They're meant to be like that. Okay. So, in the famous essay by Matthew Arnold, 1864, "The Function of Criticism at the Present Time," you see where Eliot got his title for his essays from. Arnold said, "It's because criticism has so little kept in the pure intellectual sphere, has so detached itself from practice, has been so directly polemical and controversial, that it has so ill accomplished in this country its best spiritual work." Interesting that Arnold said that. Arnold was pointing here in a direction that few critics today would even take seriously, that there is such a thing as a spiritual work of criticism. That's what I'm hoping to do today, the spiritual work of criticism, which depends, of course, on the spiritual work of poetry itself, whatever that could be. Anyone can see, of course, that poetry has basically lost its audience in our time. The number of serious readers has, as all poets know, Angela Layton will confirm this, dwindled, shall we say. While at the same time, the yearning for spiritual nourishment, for what Wallace Stevens, one of my favorite poets, called the bread of faithful speech, has only increased. I see endless books that offer some sort of spiritual guidance. Just go into a Barnes & Noble or Waterstones, and you'll see the whole shelf of them there. And in fact, if you look to see what poets are best-selling poets now, in America, they're really in any bookstore, any airport. If there are books of poetry, there are only two poets that'll be there, maybe three, but two would be Rumi, right? The Sufi mystic poet, who is, in fact, I was reading an article about this in Time magazine, by far the best-selling poet of the last 30 years in America, Rumi. Or there's a poet, she and I have the same editor at the same press, Mary Oliver. I felt rather horrible when I just met my editor in Boston for the first time. She's published, my collected poems came out a month ago. She said, well, you're the only other poet I do. I do Mary Oliver. And just to tell you, her last book of poems sold 70,000 copies. 70,000 copies for a book of poems. She is really an Episcopalian Anglican poet, and it is spiritual nature and God is what her poetry is about. But it's interesting how these are the two most popular poets in America. And I think this is partly because something in Rumi and Mary Oliver has to do with spirituality. The work of these poets confronts readers with questions of time and mortality and the use of nature as a spiritual resource and the wish for large answers to questions. I mean, in this, they're going back to Emerson in America, Nature, 1836, where he's asking large questions and he says nature is a symbol of the spirit. All natural facts in life are signs of spiritual facts. And so that is really, especially an American thing, nature and the spirit go very closely together. I've been teaching this course for many years at Middlebury College, where I've been for teaching since '82, and on poetry and spirituality. And I'm amazed by how desperate students are for spiritual guidance of some kind. They're not looking for just for answers, they're looking for some questions. You know what I mean? They're looking for not a question of answers. They want to know, what are the questions? I always begin my class by going around the room and I say, please tell me something of your religious orientation. They look startled. And and one by one, they always say, and it's the most common thing, they say, I'm spiritual but not religious. Right? You've heard that a million times. I'm spiritual but not religious. I mean, what does that mean to be spiritual? It means they're yearning. It means you're miserable. You're miserable. And you wonder, why are you miserable? And are there any ways that you can help me in not being miserable? So actually say, now we're going to begin this class in a way you'll never begin any other class while you're at university. We're going to pray for 3 minutes. They're startled. And I offer a prayer and we do a thing. It's just totally secular university. And I've had so many students over the years say, that was my best time ever at Middlebury, was when you began classes with a prayer. They've never heard of such a thing. But it was a terrific transition into our discussion of the class begins, we read the book of Psalms, and then we read Rumi, and we read the Tao Te Ching, and we read John Donne and George Herbert, and move our way through Hopkins, t.s.Eliot, and we end with Mary Oliver. So it seems appropriate to begin with at least a meditation, if not a prayer, to readjust the sensibility in the mind and start to focus in that way. So I just do that. So what I hope today to suggest is that poetry can offer spiritual direction, and that one can certainly find a good deal of spiritual direction as a Christian reader in the poems of Eliot. Needless to say, some of Eliot's friends were dubious when he joined the Anglican Church in 1927. Virginia Woolf, on hearing of his conversion, predicted he would, quote, soon drop his Christianity with his wife, as one might empty the fish bones after the herring. It's awfully mean of her. Really bad. Naughty Virginia Woolf. Of course, Eliot only recently published The Wasteland, which many regarded as the ultimate expression of post-war nihilism, the governing emotion of the poem being fear and a handful of dust. All the old symbols Eliot seemed to be suggesting were reduced to a heap of broken images. It seemed that few green branches would grow out of the stony rubbish of the post-Christian civilization that Eliot was writing about in the wake of such destruction as represented by the war. But something stirred in Eliot. I once had a conversation with one of my the first year I was teaching, I was 25 or 6 years old at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. And the first poet, they said, we have an ancient English poet coming to lecture, I.A. Richards. And we'd like you to walk him around the campus and then introduce him. So I went and picked him up at the Hanover Inn in Hanover, New Hampshire. And we took him around. He was about 95 years old. And I said, Mr. Richards, I said, I've been assigned to walk you around. He said, I was once a young Don at Cambridge in 1912, and I was asked to take Henry James around the campus. And I said to him, well, what sort of poets do you like? Do you like Hopkins? He said, those matches don't strike on my box. Never heard that before. And he said, all these Christian poets, I don't get it. He said, I was a good friend of t.s.Eliot. And he said, I'll never forget, Tom came up to Cambridge about 1924, 25. And I went to bring him a cup of tea in his room, and he wasn't in the room. It was a Sunday morning, and I wondered, where the hell has he gone? And he came back and he said, I've been to chapel. I thought, what the hell were you doing in chapel? And he said, that was the first sign that things were going downhill. So that was quite an amazing conversation as a young man I had with Richards. Of course, Eliot would certainly commit to Christianity in a big time, and he remained a committed Christian until his death in 1965. I suggested his faith was a complex affair, mingling aspects of Eastern religion, especially Hinduism and Buddhism, which he had studied very carefully at Harvard, even knew Sanskrit, with a deep sense of the Christian traditions, plural, of spirituality. Of course, his own rather stern demeanor, at least in public, had its roots in his family's connections to Boston Unitarianism, which had largely abandoned its Calvinist origins except for the belief in good works. I've always disliked Unitarians. I shouldn't say that. But I remember as a young man, I went to a special Unitarian chapel in Boston, and they sang, a mighty fortress is our mind. I said, oh dear. I left quietly by the back door. Well, the life of prayer and spiritual discipline were, however, what appealed to Eliot. Unitarianism probably struck him as rather thin gruel, with rectitude having to stand in for genuine spiritual growth. During his year in Paris, 1910-11, he attended lectures, of course, by Henri Bergson on the philosophy of time, and one sees that influence in the great Four Quartets. Eliot sometimes attended masses at La Madeleine, that glorious neoclassical temple to Christianity. The drama of the liturgy appealed immensely to Eliot, and I would guess that the origins of his Anglo-Catholicism probably lie in his attendance at those masses at La Madeleine. Eliot's work in the 30s, I'm thinking here of Ash Wednesday and Murder in the Cathedral, his great play, certainly reflect his commitment as a writer to the Christian faith. Note that I don't use the word conversion here with Eliot, as I don't think he would have really liked that term. The notion of a conversion of the Pauline variety would have seemed to him as an American Southerner as way too flamboyant and even false. I think it would have not been pleasant to him. No road to Damascus for T.S. Eliot. Rather, he pursued a quiet faith that required discipline, a careful tilling of the fields. Intellect and emotion for him fused as he explored the gradually realizing kingdom of God. And there's probably no better record of this than the Four Quartets, which unfolded over a period of 8 years from Burnt Norton, which was written or published in 1935. No doubt he saw that this poem offered a frame on which he could weave a sequence. And he did, with East Coker, the second one, begun in 1937, published 3 years later, 1940, at the beginning of the war. The third quartet seems to have come rather more quickly, published in 1941, a very bleak year, if there ever was one in British history, with London under constant siege. And one feels that pressure in this great quartet, the third one, the Dry Sauvages, with its evocation of, quote, the voices wailing, and of the withering of withered flowers. Eliot invites his readers to, quote, repeat a prayer on behalf of women who have, quote, seen their sons or husbands setting forth and not returning. In such desperate times as the war, Eliot sees that those around him eagerly look for ways to control time, to anticipate the future, if that's possible, and perhaps to look for hope or reassurance wherever you could find it. So people threw themselves, as Eliot noticed, on rather foolish practices, ways of controlling the future. Trying to read palms or draw cards from a pack at random, hoping for a sign. They turned to drugs or to psychotherapy. I say that as the husband of a psychotherapist, so I have to be very careful. I don't dare repeat a dream when I wake up. Too scary. I'm going to get all sorts of things coming at me. In the latter, though, in psychotherapy, people explore, Eliot writes, the womb or tomb or dreams. In every instance, these people are trying to discern a pattern that will help them to explain the meaning of their lives, to think about its direction. This activity, he notes, gets especially frenzied in times of war, in times of, quote, distress of nations. I love that phrase. Such understatement. This search for meaning goes on in a kind of panicky mode, but it's all quite pointless, Eliot says. Then come, for me, what are the most formidable, important, eloquent, and genuinely useful lines in the whole of the Four Quartets, which I'll read them. There's about 10 lines. I read them over and over and over again. But to apprehend the point of the intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death in love, ardor and selflessness and self-surrender. For most of us, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time, the distraction fit, lost in a shaft of sunlight, the wild time unseen, or the winter lightning, or the waterfall, or music heard so deeply it's not heard at all. But you are the music while the music lasts. There are only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses. And the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint, half guessed, the gift, half understood, is incarnation. That's about as good as poetry gets. Right there, there you got it. Since Homer, that's the best bit you're going to get. These lines are for me a kind of program for Christian living. They lay out a pattern that is immensely productive. Any literary critic will scoff at my saying this, but this is what I'm doing now, not really literary criticism. I'm actually going to use these lines as a spiritual guide. It's a form of spiritual direction from someone, Eliot, who managed in his own life to deepen and complicate his faith at the same time. Rather an intriguing notion. Emotion for him, make sure I got the right page, yes. Intriguing notion. Emotion for him fused as he explored the gradually, I know what I've done wrong here. I haven't turned the page, didn't make sense. An intriguing notion, there we go. As many Christians seem to prefer to simplify their faith, to draw hard lines around matters of dogma, to close down rather than open possibilities. Eliot allows that there are these saints among us who spend, quote, a lifetime's death in love, trying to discern the point of intersection of the timeless in time. What does that mean? I suspect that it means for Eliot, salvation is really the apprehension of time's solubility. He had learned from Henri Bergson about time as durée. This notion came from Bergson's doctoral thesis, where he drew a distinction between the real experience of time in ordinary life, he called this real duration, durée réelle, and the rigidly spatial clock time that we overlay in an attempt on a graph line. Eliot thought of the latter as a misguided attempt to impose spatial concepts on what was, in reality, an experience. Time itself, said Bergson, comes to us in the form of discrete moments. The measurement of time itself becomes an illusion. Bergson wrote, we give a mechanical explanation of a fact and then substitute the explanation for the fact itself. So Eliot combines the Bergsonian idea with the well-known Hindu idea of time as a non-linear reality. In Hinduism, as in Christianity, God is timeless. He is the, quote, still point of the turning wheel. He is now, always. Time as clock time, daily time, is simply a manifestation of God that collapses into the black hole of the absolute. One thinks of Wordsworth and his notion of spots of time. Here's that famous passage from Book 12 of the Prelude. There are in our existence spots of time that with distinct preeminence retain a renovating virtue, whence, depressed by false opinion and contentious thought, or aught of heavier or more deadly weight in trivial occupations, and the round of ordinary intercourse, our minds are nourished and invisibly repaired. Such moments are scattered everywhere, taking their date from our first childhood. A beautiful passage about spots of time and how we, again, moments in and out of time that we sometimes encounter. Well, these are moments such as Eliot refers to frequently in the Four Quartets, as in Burnt Norton. Time past and time future allow but a little consciousness. To be conscious is not to be in time, but only in time can, wonderful now catalog of moments, can the moment in the rose garden, the moment in the arbor where the rain beat, the moment in the drafty church at Smokefall be remembered. Involved with past and future. Only through time, time is conquered. So we have two kinds of time, but it's so difficult to comprehend them or to integrate them. But one needs clock time to get eternal time, to conquer it. We've all experienced these moments of reality, or I'd say platonic reality with a big R. They come to us at unattended moments, so fleeting that we almost can't believe in their importance, almost can't believe they happen if they do. The spots of time might be strung together over a lifetime. But it's only those rare people who manage to focus, as many Christians seem to prefer, to simplify their face, to draw, gotta keep turning pages. But it's only those rare people who manage to focus on these spots of time, to break through linear time in a sustained way. Eliot calls them the saints, and you think there must have been the nuns in this convent for years and years and years, whose whole life was devoted to somehow integrating those spots of time. So Eliot calls them the saints, and one can imagine nuns or brothers in their quiet cells, saints who through decades of prayer and contemplation manage to access God or the absolute. The mystics probably do this. The great Rumi, the 13th century Sufi poet, wrote again and again about time and eternity, as in this ode, which I'm going to quote, which I've reframed myself in a kind of a poem of my own, working from a very literal translation from the Persian. Here's the poem. Death is our altar, where we tie the knot with all, with everything, with God's own flame. That's the biggest secret. God is one. His beam shines through the windows and divides in hard, bright colors, shimmering the house. God's there in that blue bowl of grapes, in juice that comes from each pale globe, in wine that fills and flames us as we flush. This light that pours through everything around us, though we only see the flickering, the sparks. From sunlight into sun, a holy bond. This hot white flame that burns down days. God's in the firelight, so we spread our wings, fly toward the self-same, the consuming burn. Well, Eliot understood only too well that most of us, himself included, don't have the persistence of the saint or the mystic's wild thirst for the absolute. Instead, there is, quote, only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time. But there are also experiences of timelessness, as when, quote, the music is heard so deeply that it's not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. These are moments of absorption, where eternal time seizes us half by chance and takes us for a little dance. I suspect most of us will really know what Eliot's talking about here. We've all had these experiences. These moments or spots of time he calls hints and guesses. And that's about as far as Eliot will go. He's not willing to offer certainty, saying, here is God. The absolute's not served up on a platter. Fundamentalism, with its iron certainties, held no appeal for Eliot, and he would have recognized that this recent movement within Christianity cut against the grain of religious practice as it had evolved over 2 millennia. Incidentally, the term fundamentalist only goes back to 1920, when a Baptist layman came up with the term, alluding to a series of very literal-minded pamphlets called The Fundamentals that had been published just a few years before. After the, quote, hints and guesses, come what Eliot modestly calls the rest, and what I would consider the 5 key points of Christian practice, so beautifully framed. The rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed, the gift half understood is incarnation. This is almost too dizzyingly good. Let me work through these 5 points and regard them as this pattern for Christian living, what we can hope to achieve within the boundaries of faith. There is, first of all, wonderfully, prayer. I suspect 2 things are true. Most of us pray, and yet the word means very different things to different people. Last year, the Pew Research Center in the U.S. did an extensive survey of Americans and found that 55% of them 55% said that they prayed every day. A similar British survey found, actually you'd be surprised here, that 1 in 7 claimed they would never pray, only 1 in 7. This is from a 2013 poll reported in The Guardian. The most interesting fact for me to emerge from this latter survey, The Guardian, was that it was the youngest group, those in their 20s, who had the least objection to praying. The older you got, the more you found praying a ridiculous notion. Young people can pray easily, all the time. I suspect children pray just by walking across the street. So, but it will be obvious to everyone here that prayer is a noun without easy definition, and that praying takes many forms. I found the work of Hans Urs von Balthasar, I'm sure you're familiar with him, very useful in thinking about prayer. In his seminal work, Prayer, it was translated in 1986 and published by the Ignatius Press in America, he studies the nature and practice of prayer. He separates himself from the objectless meditation of Eastern religions and suggests that Christian prayer involves a participation in the absolute that's very direct. It's a way of being connected to the timelessness of God and involves a gaze at the Trinity itself, that triune flame, especially the incarnate Word, the divine Logos. Balthasar writes, man is a creature with a mystery in his heart that is bigger than himself. He uses the analogy of the tabernacle and suggests that each person is built like one, with a secret garden inside that's usually neglected. It is, in Balthasar's Trinitarian philosophy of prayer, the Holy Spirit that paves the way between the human and the divine, between the mortal and the immortal Jesus, between each of us and God. Balthasar formulates his idea like this, quote, there is the Father who predestines and chooses us and adopts us as his children. The Son who interprets the Father to us and gives him to us in his self-surrender unto death and the mystery of the bread. There is the Spirit who implants God's life in our souls and makes it known. It's a beautiful description of the Trinity. I've never heard better. The possibilities of prayer are endless. In fact, one can frame the practice in many dimensions. And there's a long and varied history of contemplation in prayer that I can simply gesture to here today, saying this, but nevertheless concluding that the cornerstone of faith is prayer. Talking to God is a way of participating in the living Spirit of God. It's a way of finding God within ourselves, that paradise within that Milton wrote about in the end of Paradise Lost. I don't think one can get very far in the faith practice, in any faith practice, without some form of quiet contemplation of the Godhead, listening for God, allowing the Spirit to inform us, even teach us. I'd suggest that prayer is more a form of listening than anything else. A million miles from the kinds of prayer one often hears in fundamentalist circles, as in, "Oh God, my car is making funny noises. Please let it not break down until I get to the football game," right? We have this thing in America called the prosperity gospel. Have you heard of that? I happened to be in a motel the other day, and one of these preachers came on, and he said, "My wife and I used to drive by this beautiful house, and my wife said, 'Henry, we got to have that house.' And I called up the real estate agent, and it was $5 million. And so I got down on my knees in front of that house, and I said, 'God, give me this house.' And he said, 'I'm here to say to you all in my audience, God gave me that house. Send money to the following number, and God will give you a house.'" It's called the prosperity gospel. It's such an outrage. But in America, it's amazing what will work. Well, let's move on to the second thing, observance. Eliot, in middle age, became a warden of St. Stephen's Church in Kensington. I once went there myself with Mrs. Eliot, who recalled that he visited this church almost daily. He rose early, going to Mass before breakfast, returning to eat a light meal before he spent the morning at his desk. He also went on regular retreats. Indeed, the final quartet, Little Gidding, was inspired by the small Anglican religious community founded at this site in Cambridgeshire in the early 17th century by Nicholas Ferrar. Needless to say, this was a high church community devoted to the Book of Common Prayer and to religious rituals. Is observance necessary then for the Christian life? I would say yes, of course it is. Mere mortals need communion. They need to gather around an altar. They need to worship together, to praise God, to see themselves as part of a larger body, what's often called the body of Christ. Public prayer, communal confession, sharing the sacred meal, these are just parts of the pattern, but they are useful parts. And the observance of holidays, holy days, saints' days, is important, as this observance keeps us fastened to the faith, lit up by its brighter moments. I think it's easy to fall away, to lose oneself in distraction fits, Eliot's great phrase, that overwhelm us. It was in Burnt Norton that he surveyed the commuters in London with their, quote, time-ridden faces, distracted from distraction by distraction. That, my friends, describes me much of the time, and probably you as well. So we need observance, which functions to bring us back to ourselves, back to the possibilities of the Spirit, back to God. Now, observance as a practice leads in the direction of discipline, which is in effect a widening of the notion of observance. Eliot was himself a very disciplined man who adapted at a fairly early age to life working in a bank, with its long hours and obvious pressures of conformity. He dressed for work and went to the office year after year. When I once visited Mrs. Eliot at her flat in Kensington, very close to here, she took me into the bedroom and opened his closet door, and there were 17 pinstriped suits. Every day he put on a pinstriped suit, and she said he had 17 of them on the day of his death. And she had kept them there until about 5 years ago, when she died about 2 years ago or something. I don't know when. So he dressed for work, went to the office year after year. In later years, he'd spend the afternoon at Faber's, the publishing house where he worked as a director. As a writer, he understood the discipline of tradition, going back to Aristotle, Horace, and Quintilian. To a degree, he acquired this love of tradition from Irving Babbitt, his old professor at Harvard. But in essays written after his conversion, he took issue with the humanism of Irving Babbitt, as with that of Matthew Arnold, as an attempt to replace religion with art. By 1927, Eliot had come to embrace the Anglo-Catholic vein of Christianity, as he thought that enlightenment would only come within the practices of a sturdy tradition. In 1951, he wrote that, quote, "No man has ever climbed to the higher stages of the spiritual life who has not been a believer in a particular religion or at least a particular philosophy." In his essay of 1930, Religion Without Humanism, he writes that the difficult discipline is the discipline of and training of the emotions. He added that he had only found this through dogmatic religion. And in a commentary that appeared in his journal, The Criterion, April 1932, he spoke of, quote, "the discipline of an exact religious faith." I'd suggest here Eliot is not just making an argument for theological rigidity. That he alludes to such a broad range of religions and traditions in Four Quartets implies that he valued many and varied religious disciplines, including Hinduism and Buddhism, both of which had been attractive to him at various stages in his life. In East Coker, he speaks of poetry as, quote, "a raid on the inarticulate." And I would venture that for him, religious practice was conducive to this work of raiding. Eliot knew that discipline was required in both writing and faith, and that without a firm grip on what went before, one could not really create in the moment. The work of the poet, as conceived by Eliot, tells us about what the work of the Spirit meant to him and how he sought to practice his faith actively. In an essay on Jacques Maritain, he noted that if poetry is not to become, quote, "a lifeless repetition of forms," then the poet must explore, quote, "the frontiers of spirit." He added rather cautiously, "The frontiers of spirit are more like the jungle, which, unless continuously kept under control, is always ready to encroach and eventually obliterate the cultivated area." So the discipline he refers to in the Dry Salvages, which I quoted at length earlier, involves more than mere repetition, as in liturgical repetitions, although Eliot, as a poet and Anglo-Catholic, loved those repetitions. But he obviously remained aware of, even fearful of, the possibility that one's practice in either poetry or religion could sink into, quote, "a lifeless repetition." The counterbalance to lifeless or rote repetition is obviously the next word, thought. Thought. Of course, Eliot believed in, quote, "the direct sensuous apprehension of thought," great phrase from his essay called The Metaphysical Poets. He believed one must cultivate the union of thought and feeling to the point where the one became fused with the other. This was a drive toward integration or wholeness, and it requires conscious effort, at least in Eliot's poetic practice. He referred to, quote, "a recreation of thought into feeling." One imagines that in prayer, in church, while reading scriptures, Eliot worked to turn thought into feeling, a process of apprehension, the accession of sensory experience in ways that seem to transcend mundane realities, those spots of time, as the moment in the rose garden that one can hardly bear, as in his great line, "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." One of my favorite lines of Eliot's. He liked it so much he used it twice. It's in Murder in the Cathedral. It's in the Four Quartets. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Eliot prefaced Four Quartets with two fragments, as you may remember, from Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher. One of them seems relevant here when thinking about faith. The quotation in English goes roughly like this: "Although there is one center, most people live in centers of their own." Well, here's the discipline of thought, focusing on the center, which is, of course, just another word for God. The practice of faith demands attention to one center, not the ordinary and disastrous life of secular unconsciousness, the descent into subjectivity that has long seemed the most sophisticated, even cool way to live. Center is really a version of the Greek word logos, which is the underlying intelligibility of the world. the shaping of reality that underlies all consciousness. A philosophical version of the unified field theory that has obsessed physicists in the modern age. I think Eliot's thought drives us toward this unified field, toward this center, toward the word or logos that was there at the beginning, as in the opening lines of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the word. In East Coker, Eliot tells himself, I said to my soul, be still. That stillness, he suggests, involves waiting. Quote, the faith and the love and the hope are all in the waiting. He says firmly, wait without thought, for you are not ready for thought. He's talking to himself there. This is a wonderful description of meditation or prayer, waiting, allowing consciousness to fill slowly, moving toward what Eliot calls the stillness, the dancing. This is the still point of the turning world. It's the seeking for God here in waiting for thought, but thought isn't absent. It comes before and after the stillness. It prepares the ground for the center. It comes after the moment in the rose garden, after the encounter with God as reflection. Many critics have noted that the Four Quartets move from intense or symbolic images or moments of almost mystical vision to abstract discursive passages, as in, I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant. I've always loved that line. It's actually, I always tell my students, it's one of the worst lines of English poetry, right? It's like Hopkins' The Windhover. The second worst line in English poetry is, my heart in hiding stirred for a bird. Sorry, Gerard, that doesn't make it. Yet I love my heart in hiding. I sometimes wonder if that, I can see Eliot with his fake English accent, you know? I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant. Do you like my English accent? It's as good as Eliot's, which of course refers to the Bhagavad Gita. Eliot shows us Eliot thinking here, which is really a form of wondering. He wonders about the strangeness of time, the flux that is life, and the communal work of consciousness. I say communal because, as the quotation from Heraclitus suggests, Eliot's trying to move beyond the isolation of the individual, beyond subjectivity. And here practice comes in once again. Religious practice insists, of course, on community. We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. We become one body, and so forth. The power of the practice is the power of community, the looking outward as well as the looking inward that faith demands. And this leads us to the final prong of Eliot's 5 things, right? The final prong, action. One thinks of the letter of James, verse 2:17. Faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. Powerful stuff. One can't resist thinking of the eightfold path of Buddhism here, which directs us out of the cycles of life and death. These involve right understanding or vision, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. I would say that all of these are forms of action, moving in the world, reaching outward. Suffering is alienation from God in both Buddhism and Christianity. The way of Jesus involves making choices about how we live among our neighbors. Do we treat them like ourselves? Do we love God and our neighbor? Do we love God in our neighbor, which is probably the only way one can indeed love God, as the Desert Fathers taught. I don't know if you know much about the Desert Fathers, but Rowan Williams has written beautifully about all of this. Loving God in our neighbor. Of course, one could see the entire Sermon on the Mount as a theoretical guide to right action. It's also a discourse on karma, at least in the notion that whatever one sows, one eventually reaps. In a larger sense, the entire life of Christ might be taken as a guide to right action or ethical behavior. Jesus didn't simply say that we should love our neighbors as ourselves. He showed us how to accomplish this. He focused on the poor, those who were blessed in the Beatitudes. He lived communally with his disciples. sharing meals, praying, putting into practice ideals that rose in the process of thought. He had no pretensions and sought the company of those on the margins, prostitutes, the lame, the mentally ill, the hungry. He sat with lepers. He knelt with others and prayed. Right action in Eliot no doubt suggests living an ethical life, conceived in terms that seem fairly consistent with all the world's religions, and the elements of which are evident in the Eightfold Path as well as in the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount, which reformulates, redefines, and extends the law of Moses, as when Jesus put forward those wonderful antitheses, as so an eye for an eye becomes turn the other cheek, and so forth. One could go on about that. It would be a mistake, however, not to see that there is individual effort in right action. Carl Jung, the psychologist, once suggested that right action comes from right thinking. And there is no cure and no improving the world that does not begin with the individual, himself or herself. This means discernment, knowing the right thing to do. One obeys God, of course, because one discerns that this is the right thing to do. And discernment is part of action. And it means being awake to what is going on, as noted in 1 John 3, 17, 18. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. Amazing stuff. In 1935, Eliot published his great essay, Religion and Literature, his summary statement on the connection between these closely related practices. He didn't wish to see literature as divorced from ethics, from religious thought, from the pursuit of God's kingdom. Quote, he wrote, "I am convinced that we fail to realize how completely and yet how irrationally we separate our literary from our religious judgments." Eliot wrote, "It seems obvious it's Eliot wrote, so it seems obvious to me that he didn't make this mistake in his own life." I'd go further. In Four Quartets, especially in the 5th section of the Dry Salvages, he offers this sublime pattern for Christian living, asking us to think about prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action in fresh ways. He invites us to kneel, quote, where prayer has been valid, as he says in Little Gidding. His work remains for me, and for many readers like me, I suspect, a rather stern but salutary guide to religious practice, as he fuses thought and feeling, as he urges us to wait in stillness, to listen to the voice, and to discern what we must do. Thank you very much. Very sweet.